Welcome to Cultural Mixtapes. I'm Tejas Srinivasan, and this is a show where I try to probe the minds of writers, musicians, artists, and pretty much anyone else making interesting contributions to the cultural zeitgeist. On today's episode, we have writer, critic, and lecturer at Emerson College and Harvard University, Maggie Doherty. Doherty's writing has appeared in several places, including The New Yorker, The New York Times, the Yale Review, and The Nation. She's also the author of the book The Equivalents, a story of art, female friendship, and liberation in the 1960s, which was published by Penguin Random House in 2020 and reviewed to critical acclaim by several writers, including novelist Margaret Atwood. Doherty published a piece in the Yale Review on June 24th that poses important questions about the way Americans tell abortion stories. By comparing present-day narratives with historical records from the middle of the 20th century, she questions whether Americans today are too apologetic. We spoke in early July and used this piece as a starting point for our conversation. She alternated between the present and the past to illuminate gaping issues in the way social justice for women's rights is shaping in the public sphere. This is not dissimilar from the subject of her book, The Equivalents, which focuses on the Radcliffe Institute for Independent Study in the 1960s. Doherty tracks the development of 5 women who were part of the institute, as well as the simultaneous emergence of Second Wave Feminism. This was quite a memorable conversation that stressed the urgency of women's rights in this country, the power of art making, and the imperative to historicize when evaluating social trends in the United States. A quick note, we refer to several writers throughout the conversation, and their names are all listed in the description. Hope you enjoy the show. Maggie Doherty, thank you so much for being here today. I want to start with the latest essay that you wrote in the Yale Review on June 24th, which was the day that Roe v. Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court. And in your analysis of the way abortion stories are told in the press and in the public, you ask if we need to be more radically honest. So could you say what exactly you mean by radical honesty and how exactly it applies to abortion narratives?
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much for having me. It's so exciting to talk about this stuff. And yeah, thanks for reading the essay. It was a busy news day, so it's it's nice to hear that it made it out there in the world. A kind of funny thing. So radically honest is one of those subheads that I actually don't write, right? So it's interesting because it sort of suggests that that's something that another reader saw in the piece, which really struck me when it came out because I hadn't necessarily thought about the kind of argument I was making as an argument about honesty. So basically, in the piece, I say that we've been trying to use stories about abortion in the last 30 years to kind of elicit sympathy in readers, to make readers understand abortion patients as relatable, sympathetic, well-behaved women, girls, and people who have had something horrible happen to them. And for them, abortion is kind of a way out of suffering. And those stories exist, those experiences exist, but there are also other experiences that exist among abortion patients. People who simply don't want to have children, people who can't have children, people for whom it's not a way out of suffering, but rather a kind of exercise of autonomy, of control over one's body and one's life. And what I was suggesting in the piece is that sometimes this emphasis on the most sympathetic or traumatized experience was going to make abortion seem like something that should only go to people who are suffering, only go to people who are kind of marginalized in that way, whereas I think it should be a kind of universal right. And so I guess what's interesting about this idea of honesty is it's kind of, there's sort of two senses, right? So there's a sense in which we could say that these very sympathetic narratives are radically honest. They're telling about the experience in all of this great detail. And that is so important for people to understand. But maybe there's another level of honesty, which is almost a kind of reductive version of honesty. What happens when we strip away this experience to its most kind of bare bones, step-by-step process? It is all the same for everyone, kind of no matter what reason they have for seeking an abortion, ultimately it's the same thing. It's the same choice, or it's the same, maybe not a choice, but it's the same kind of end result. And so I think the piece is maybe kind of floating these different possibilities about what it means to speak honestly about abortion, whether it's in great detail or whether it's more in this kind of simple statement of fact. I had an abortion, that's what happened.
Now, it's interesting that an editor threw that on there because it can be taken many different ways, regardless how they view that term honesty. But when you say you take the emotion, take all the, I guess, I don't want to say fluff, but all the pathos in the writing out of any abortion story, do you think there's any consequences of that on the flip side, consequences from taking out the emotion that makes it seem like perhaps this right to abortion is not necessary if narratives that are painted are all fairly clear cut?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. It's one that I've thought a lot about and talked to a lot of other, writers, activists, people working in repro about. And so, yeah, so I have a few different thoughts. So, I mean, I think the first thing, right, and this is going to sound kind of like a smart aleck, and I don't mean to be, but if it worked, if this tactic worked, it would have worked, right? And it didn't. Here we are. So it does make me think, all right, there's to some degree the proof is in the pudding. If inculcating sympathy was going to make people in power, right? Because we're talking about, a right-wing movement that has obtained power in the country. If we were going to reach those particular political actors with these kind of stories of sympathy, or reach their constituents or base, it would have happened. People would have been able to see this as a deeply necessary medical procedure. So the other thing I think is that kind of popular opinion on abortion is really complicated to actually gauge, or is kind of a hard question to gauge. We have all these polls about whether Americans support abortion, whether they support restrictions, but they're always framed in the abstract. It's always, do you support abortion in the second trimester? And people conjure whatever they conjure in their imagination to respond to it. And then they say no, or they say yes, but until a certain point. But that is often, they're often imagining scenarios that are not very similar to the many scenarios under which people seek abortions. And they would maybe respond very differently if the question was something like, do you think that a woman with cancer, with a cancer diagnosis and a non-viable fetus should terminate the pregnancy in order to receive chemotherapy? And it's like, yes, for a lot of people. And so in a way, that might tempt you to think, oh, actually, we do need these sympathetic narratives. But I think what I keep seeing is that connection isn't made. An opinion on abortion as a thing is often not connected to this question of what should this person do in this particular situation. And so I think, it does, people don't always make the connection between whatever sympathetic story they're reading, where they say, oh my gosh, yes, ectopic pregnancy for sure. Yes, that's a good medical procedure, but I still don't think abortion should be legal in the second trimester, right? Like, it's just very hard to get these things to touch. And I guess, my last kind of scattered thought to this is that I think it's very, very hard for a political movement, and especially a rights-based movement, to win by being kind of defensive and concessionary. I don't know if concessionary is a word, but conciliatory, giving concessions, because it just kind of moves the goalposts back and back and back and back, such that, you frame things as, well, but wouldn't you want this kind of deeply sympathetic, sort of horrifying case to be, treated well, or to sort of have, the opportunity to be resolved? And it's just every time you kind of walk things back from being a universal right, or a right to which people shouldn't have to, defend or explain, it just seems like the battle gets a little bit harder to fight if what you want is ultimately bodily autonomy for everyone, a kind of right to control one's own reproductive life. So that's kind of where I've come down on that question, that it does need to be articulated in a more universal, unapologetic way.
You give an example in your piece about when it was at a point in history in the late 60s, the Red Stockings movement. Could you say a little bit about how that movement spoke about the issue of women's rights and abortion, and if parts of that can be applied to the way people are talking about it today?
Yeah, so I mean, anyone who's interested in this, Red Stockings were one of several radical feminist cells, groups in New York City in the late 1960s, early 1970s. They have a website. You can actually just go to it, and it has lots of pamphlets and, old materials from that era. And you can actually listen to a tape recording of this speak out. So I encourage anyone who's listening to check it out. But I think it was a very different moment in US history, a very different moment in feminist history, when there was, a lot of what was called consciousness raising at the time for women in these organizations, where they were starting to talk about experiences that had been seen as purely personal or that had been kind of depoliticized. A lot of these women were organizers with either the civil rights movement or the New Left or the student movement. And time and again, any concern they'd had about love, sex, family, motherhood had been kind of pushed aside by these organizations as not political or not serious and deserving of scrutiny and action. And so they had come together to organize around these political but personal issues. This is where we get the slogan, "The personal is political," from Second Wave Feminism. And we're really fighting for these rights. So this is the same kind of moment that you start seeing Take Back the Night get organized against rape and sexual violence. It's the same moment where another kind of sector of second wave feminism, liberal feminism, is organizing and agitating for equal pay for equal work, for non-discrimination in the workplace. So it's a very exciting moment. There's lots of different kind of prongs to second wave feminism. This particular group had taken on abortion as an issue. Abortion laws were being reformed at the time. They were being expanded, liberalized. But the real thing that I think strikes me as so insightful and important about Red Stockings thinking around this issue is that they did not want to be beholden to experts, to appointed experts, to men, namely, who had been designated the people who were going to decide what should happen with abortion law. And they had claimed that expertise for themselves. They said, we are the ones who get pregnant. We should be the ones who make decisions about how pregnancy laws should work. And the speak out that I was referring to in the piece that they arranged in March of '69 was performance of that expertise. It was a way of saying, we know why, we are the ones in control of our bodies. We know what should happen to them. It's our right to decide, in part because they were claiming this expertise and claiming this knowledge and power. They didn't try to do a lot of the explanatory work that we see in some more recent abortion stories, saying, well, here's why I did this. Here's why having a baby wasn't right for me. Or here's how much I wanted it, but here's what went wrong. They were more interested in saying, I had an abortion and it was, it's something I should be able to do more easily, or I had an abortion and it was a great decision and here's why I'm fighting for it. So that was a difference that really struck me, that kind of claiming and owning of expertise and power that I do think is maybe worth imitating in our own time.
Yeah, I think one of the most surprising parts of your piece was you mentioned the group of experts that New York had convened to make this decision, and it was 14 men and a nun as a group of experts on what women should do with their bodies. Now, you mentioned, without giving any concessions, how people have to organize around this issue, and it strikes me similar to what happened a few days ago in Texas when the woman said that she should not be ticketed for driving in the HOV lane because she was pregnant. That being, I guess, necessary irony in this issue, what do you think organizing around this issue looks like without any concessions?
Oh man, great question. And I am not the person to answer it because I have not been doing this organizing for years. And I do think that's an important thing to remember, right? So abortion has been inaccessible to many Americans for a very long time. So once Planned Parenthood v. Casey is ruled in 1992, and we have this new standard of patients can't experience an undue burden when seeking an abortion. Undue burden is very open to interpretation. So we've seen since the 90s, really, I guess, beginning in the 80s, but especially since the 90s, just tons and tons of restrictions. If you go to get an abortion in Arkansas, I think it's a 72-hour waiting period, and you have to have 2 in-person appointments. So I mean, just think about the time and loss of wages, childcare, everything that would go into trying to get an abortion under those conditions. It's already functionally inaccessible may as well be illegal before Dobbs and before the overturn of Roe. And so what this means in a positive sense is that we have tons of organizers and activists who have been organizing under conditions of functional illegality for a long time. And so I think they're the ones who can speak best to what's uncompromising, positive rights-based organizing looks like. One thing that I have heard in those circles, and I think is important to reiterate, given some of the iconography of, coat hangers and illegal abortions, is that illegal abortions can be very safe. Just because something is illegal doesn't mean it's necessarily dangerous, and that, mutual aid and communities have been facilitating people's abortions forever, like dating back to whenever people started getting pregnant, people were helping each other terminate their pregnancies. So that, for me at least, is a useful reminder, as sort of scary as it is to think about new laws, as awful as the suffering is that people will experience under these laws, we also do have this tradition of mutual aid and facilitating abortion that goes back forever, and that, is bound to a higher law than the law of the US state that sees this as a moral right that needs to be facilitated under any conditions.
I want to switch gears to your book, and your book, The Equivalence, is very closely related with the development of second wave feminism in the 60s. We already mentioned it once in this interview. I guess first, what in your opinion is second wave feminism? Because there are a lot of minute differences on the nuances there. And then can you say a little bit about how your book, and specifically the art created by these women, is intertwined with and in many cases influential on the progression of second wave feminism?
Yeah, second wave feminism. So some people really hate the waves model of feminism, right? Where there's the first wave, which you have sort of suffragism in the United States, and then you have the second wave, which is what we've been talking about, this period in the 60s and 1970s when there was a lot of organizing and agitation. Third wave, which is kind of when I was growing up in the 90s, where it was sort of like, what is feminism now? We've fixed gender inequality. What are we supposed to do? And then fourth wave, that sometimes is associated with a rethinking or more expansive thinking around gender and womanhood, especially. Some people hate this. I kind of don't mind it as a basic taxonomy or a basic heuristic. There's a reason probably that I'm not an academic historian and I'm instead a literary critic who moonlights as one. So I think it's useful just for designating this moment, which is an interesting moment. And this is what I was really interested in and exploring in my book, where you have World War II with all the kind of upheavals socially, politically, economically that accompany war often for nations. And then you have the end of that war and the beginning of the Cold War, which introduces, this period of intense conformity in American culture, and a real stifling of gender expression, a real stifling of sexuality, a real encouragement for people to kind of march in lockstep. This dovetails with a strong period of unionization in the United States, by which you could have a single breadwinner family, a very rare moment in American history where one income could support a nuclear family. And so all of these factors kind of combine to enact this real regression and kind of retrenchment for everyone, including women, which then erupts in the 1960s as people start to, try to break out of these these kind of familial prisons. I'm always reminded of Betty Friedan's infamous line about the American family at this time, which was that it was a comfortable concentration camp. And so, she had a real taste for the polemical and the hyperbolic. So in the wake of this, the period of the 50s, where there was a ton of really important organizing going on at the time. I should clarify that this is also the period of civil rights organizing. It's also the period of, some really intense union organizing. But we often think of real beginning of what we think of as second wave feminism as a 1960s phenomenon. And so in my book, as I was just saying a moment ago, the second wave doesn't come out of nowhere. There are people who are thinking about these issues and involved with these issues for a long time. And so in my book, I was very curious about that period right before the more sort of famous and well-known moment of feminist activism in the 1960s. I was curious about women who were kind of in between these historical moments, who were getting married and having children in the 50s, who were a little bit older than some of the women who were really, really active in the feminist movement in the 1960s. And I was kind of curious about their experience. And I was also curious if I could track some patterns or influences or developments between the conformist period of the 50s and the more revolutionary period of the 1960s. And so the book centers on the Radcliffe Institute for Independent Study, which is an institution out of Radcliffe College, Harvard's sister school, that was founded in 1960. And it was supposed to be a fellowship program, basically, for talented women. So my book centers on that institution and in particular on a group of writers and artists, two poets, Anne Sexton and Maxine Kumin, the fiction writer Tilly Olson, and then a couple of artists, the painter Barbara Swan and the sculptor Mariana Pineda, who met and became friends and who felt themselves to be kind of, sorting out the very issues that we're talking about, to be sort of transitioning a little bit between a more staid and confined understanding of gender and life and family and motherhood towards something a little bit more expansive.
And then specifically on the writers that you mentioned, Anne Sexton and Maxine Kumin, you write that at the beginning of their careers, they didn't really identify with the term feminist and they were just creating their art. You called them, quote, proper Boston poets for a while. How do you think this transition occurred throughout their career? By the end of their life, I believe Kumin wrote about Sexton that she was writing truths about women's lives long before there was a women's movement. How do you think that progression occurred over the course of the Institute?
This is a question that I really struggled with writing the book because what you want, or maybe this is just what marketers want, or what your marketing publicity team want, or what your agent wants, wants a really neat narrative. We can even think about this almost in Aristotelian terms or MFA workshop terms about, okay, what makes a good story? How do characters develop? And usually it's like the character encounters the character is around, they encounter an obstacle, they work to overcome that obstacle, they grow and change, right? This is like MFA terminology. They grow and change, they develop, they end someplace different from where they began. And there's some sort of, climax, denouement, etc. This is not actually a narrative structure that I was able to graft onto this particular history. I sort of wished when I started the book that what happened was, oh my gosh, these women, they're not enlightened. But then they get to the Institute, they find feminism, they find each other, they emerge as revolutionaries. Like, that would be so great. That is not really what happened, both because some of the women in my book came in with a different kind of political or class or gendered consciousness. So Tilly Olson, the writer, was a socialist organizer since she was 18. She was a member of the Young Communist League, always thought a lot about labor, both domestic and, wage labor. And so she was older, she was 50 by the time she went to the Institute. And so for her, the Institute was not this moment of, consciousness raising or kind of an expanded political consciousness. It was actually kind of a reprieve from that. It was a moment to connect with Sexton, whom she had developed a correspondence with. It was a moment to focus on her creative life. And so it meant something very different to her. Whereas for someone like Anne Sexton, the poet, she did have a kind of, if not awakening, a kind of new understanding of what it meant to be a woman when she found herself in a community of women. She was always someone who was very comfortable around men, who was very attracted to men, who were also very attracted to her. And so there was something very special, it seems, for her to actually have these 2 years to be among women and think really carefully about what it means to be a woman poet and a woman writer. But she didn't emerge a revolutionary either. She did not become, as you said from that wonderful Kumin quote, she was interested in female experience. She was interested in motherhood. She was interested in representing those things honestly. But she used to say, I hate being anthologized in these women's studies anthologies. They just take my I hate men poems and they leave out everything else. It is this kind of messy, contradictory, highly individualized experience that I ended up writing about for these 5 women. But I think the thing that maybe unites them, and maybe the way that I do see it kind of tracking historically and politically, is this interest in the representation of female complexity, the representation of female experience, breaking certain taboos around that, writing or making art about pregnancy, about motherhood, about female erotic life. That did feel really new and exciting, and did seem to lead nicely into some of the political and artistic and creative developments that we associate with that later period of feminism.
This is my attempt to tie it in with what's going on today. You mentioned breaking the taboos behind the female experience. Well, women's rights in this country are clearly struggling based on June 24th, but they're not as archaic as they were 50 years ago. Is there a way to move further and break the taboos beyond abortion that you perhaps wanted to hint in that article?
No, that's a really interesting and provocative question, because in a way, one is tempted to say, oh, we don't live in an age of taboo anymore. We are able to say, I mean, despite what people will say about sort of cancel culture or, the woke mob or whatever, that we actually do live in an era where you kind of have a lot of access to speaking, to not necessarily to being listened to, but there are certainly, fewer taboos on talking about experience, on making art about certain kinds of experiences, that there are different audiences that you can reach, there are different platforms that you can connect to. So in a way, I'm kind of tempted to say, oh, actually, like, we don't have that kind of censorious culture. Maybe another way to think about this is, what do we want out of representation? Which is kind of a horribly baggy question. but what, when we say we want stories or art about certain experiences that maybe haven't been recognized, haven't been understood, I do think it's important to ask what the aims of that are, or what the goal of that kind of storytelling or art making is. So just to tag back quickly to the moment that I discussed in my book, I think because that culture was so aversive to speaking about anything unusual or what was seen as kind of deviant or strange, it was important to represent some of these taboo experiences, if only because it informed readers and viewers that they weren't alone in having certain experiences and impulses. I think it had a kind of consciousness raising effect. I don't know necessarily that today what we need is more consciousness raising. So to go back to the abortion question, and I think you've picked up on some of the ambiguities in my piece, or some of the ways that I was wary of prescribing particular action or prescribing particular storytelling, because I don't know necessarily that telling a story the right way or telling more kinds of stories is going to galvanize something. I don't know that that's what it does. I don't know that it's going to change people's ideas or change people's opinions, or do the kind of consciousness raising work that I do think was happening a little bit more 50 years ago, or was more the purpose, or was more necessary. I know that I'm not giving a definitive answer, which seems to be kind of a story of my life in some ways, trying to kind of trouble the situation rather than clarify it. I think there's been a lot of talk, about representation, about breaking taboos, and I think we've made a lot of progress in that regard, such that maybe now it's a good time to ask, okay, if I do represent this experience, if I do tell this story, what is the effect I hope it's going to have? What is the aim of that? And is that aim, if it's a political aim, maybe achieved better in another way than simply telling or representing?
Thank you for that. And just trouble the situation more than rectify it. That sounds exactly like something Derrida would say, and I love that.
Oh, well, I should say I do have a pet interest in psychoanalysis, which is really not that evident, I think, in that much of my work, so probably not in my book. But if you can probably see it in my criticism. That's a very much an intellectual tradition where Derrida kind of emerges from as well, that does look for these kind of contradictions, ambiguities, and that does sort of see the unconscious, operating in this unruly fashion. That's always going to make things a little bit less neat than they seem. So that's probably where some of my impulse to do that comes from.
You've also spoken about being a union organizer. Reading through your work, whether it's criticism or a piece like the one we've talked about, there's always a light tone of wanting to take action, almost some sort of call to action. Might not necessarily be that clear. But how do you think your organizing work has affected the way you view art, and as well as the way you view cultural trends?
That's, another great question. I love a light tone of wanting to take action, because I think that I'm often sometimes not criticized. It's been observed in the past that I am a writer with a light touch, and so that's that kind of nice echo in that respect. So it's complicated in some ways, because honestly, organizing takes a ton of time. It is a real time suck. It is, something that you can give your whole life to. And so I've had periods when I was doing it really intensely. And I've had periods where I've had to really, really step back, because otherwise I would not be able to teach my classes or do my writing, and never mind take care of my family, etc. So in a way, I would love to say, oh, organizing and writing, and they feed into each other in this beautiful symbiotic fashion. Oftentimes I felt them to really be in conflict. And I've also felt them to be in conflict in a kind of intellectual sense where everyone asks, how can I ever justify writing? This is not a new question. This is a question that's been asked all the time. It may be asked now with a certain amount of urgency, given the kind of crises and catastrophes that we're experiencing, every day. How do I justify sitting down to write a book review, to write an essay, to write, a personal essay, whatever, what have you? And I think that those questions can become especially acute when you also know and recognize your own capacity as a worker, as a political actor, to do something that's not writing, that is actually more effective in addressing things. So there is a real kind of knot here, but the redeeming but, I would say that being aware of your capacity to change things in your community or in your workplace is really empowering. It can make you feel more hopeful. It can make you feel more energized. It can make you feel more optimistic. It can give you the pessimism of the intellect, the optimism of the will to kind of keep doing things. And in that respect, I think having had experiences of changing a situation for the better, of being in solidarity with other people, of, enacting, or it just kind of goes back to our red stockings discussion, claiming power as a community. I think it lets me look for those things in the writing and the reading and the thinking that I do. It makes me maybe more attuned to them. It also does raise a question, though, that I've been thinking a lot recently, which is, if in my political life, I'm committed to some sort of collective politics and collective action, how then do I justify, or how then do I understand the focus on the individual that occurs in so much art criticism and literary criticism and writing? And what would it mean to focus on the communal or the collective in that space? And I guess that's part of what was going on with my book. Part of my book was looking to find the collective, to find the institutional, to find the communal, even in artistic and literary history that is very driven by and interested in individuals. So that's kind of maybe, if I started with these two things being in tension, but maybe now I can make a dialectical move and say that there is maybe an ability or a way that having both collective political experience and a kind of individualist attention to artists and writers can be resolved in writing when we look for the structures and communities and coteries that support individual artists and think about their work in that light.
Two things you just brought up. First, how do you justify writing? And then the second thing, the mention of the collective. That's sort of in line with something I've been trying to figure out for a while, especially in the last episode with the poet Jay Perini. It's like, what purpose does art, regardless of what form it's in, what purpose does that serve in the world we live in when it feels like pretty much anything else, even another form of writing in journalism, might be more effective or more urgent? In your opinion, what purpose does art serve, and what can it serve in a very idealistic way?
Oh, we're getting the big questions. Okay. Really just going for it. So first, I do think art making is a meaningful experience that people have engaged in since they have been on this earth, and it's kind of not going anywhere, right? Like, it's very, very hard to imagine a world in which people cease to write and make art. You can go back. We were watching with my partner and his son a few weeks ago. We were watching the Werner Herzog documentary, Cave of Forgotten Dreams. And these are whatever hunter-gatherer nomadic communities who are returning year after year in this kind of quasi-religious pilgrimage to paint horses and saber-toothed tigers and things like that on cave walls. So I think it's part of us. I think it's there. And so in a way, and this is maybe a cheat, but it's like, it's going to be happening whether we can justify it or not. It's simply, we are going in the same way that I think, well, we are going to continue to care for each other during these catastrophes. People have always cared for each other. People have always loved each other. People have always striven to take care of the people they care for. So that's kind of consoling, maybe in some respect. I think the other thing maybe to think about is, if we look at the history of revolutionary communities, revolutionary activity, art has always been a part of that. art and criticism and thought has always been a part of that, whether you want to think about, Lenin and the Russian Revolution, and not to say, Marx and Engels as well, or whether you want to look at, socialist realism, the painting and sculpting and mural making that came out of, the Popular Front in the 1930s. Art making can be vexed under those conditions, because you'll have people saying, well, this doesn't help the movement, don't write in this kind of Joycean manner. We need to be writing in this kind of highly readable manner. I'm Mike Gold or whatever. And so it doesn't necessarily mean, the question of how to make art has been answered, or what kind of art we should make has been answered, what we should write. I think that's open to interpretation. But writing and art making has always been seen as part of political organizing and action taking. So I don't think it's a waste, I guess. I think it's going to be there. It's going to have a role. I don't necessarily know what that role is or should be, but it does not make me think it's not worth doing.
Wonderful. I think that's a great place to end off. But last question, what have you been reading, watching, and or listening to that you've been excited about?
Great. So I have been reading for a bunch of upcoming reviews, which is always the case, but I'll just, call out these authors because I think they're great and interesting. Returning to Cormac McCarthy, who's an old favorite of mine from college. He's got a new book coming out soon. I've been starting to get into Kathy Acker, who I actually am not that familiar with, but she has a biography of hers coming out soon. I returned to Norman Rush's Mating, which is maybe my favorite novel. And maybe I think probably one of the best novels written, one of the best studies of desire, I would say, in the American literary tradition. And sort of off of that, or in dialogue with that, I finally read the philosopher Gillian Rose's Love's Work recently, which came out in the late 90s. It was a book she wrote as she was dying of cancer, and is her attempt to think through. It's not even that dogmatic. I shouldn't even give it away, give it a structure or a mission that it doesn't have. It's a really, really kind of fascinating account of some of her personal experiences and the philosophical insights that she derived from them. I am a reader mostly. I am reading. So, the music and television and film is less present in my life than I would like it to be. But I will say we did just watch Children of Men recently, which I had never seen. And I think I only mentioned this because, we've been talking about catastrophe. We've been talking about crisis, and this is a movie about catastrophe and crisis. And, maybe in a kind of interesting reversal, my partner came away from it thinking it was very optimistic, and I came away from it thinking it was very pessimistic. So I am not an optimist all the time, as maybe where I should end this.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And that's our show. Special thanks to Maggie Doherty for joining me on this episode. To learn more about her work and see a list of her recommendations, visit the show notes in the description. Thank you very much for listening to this episode. Cultural Mixtapes is written and produced by me, Tejas Srinivasan. The music you heard on today's episode was Beethoven's Sonata No. 26 and Chopin's Sonata No. 2, recorded by me. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe, review, and share on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. Thank you very much for listening.